All right, guys, so we were just finishing with the Korean War, and now we have to move on to the arms race. Following the development of, or the research that will begin to develop the hydrogen bomb, it must be noted that on November 1st, 1952, the U.S. successfully tests its first hydrogen bomb. To nobody's surprise, really, the USSR is going to match that accomplishment no less than a year later, okay? So here's the thing. This is what's going on. The U.S. is definitely afraid of the possibility that the Soviets might be on track to beating it, or, you know, beating the United States, becoming more supreme in influence and political power and nuclear power, or, you know, atomic bomb power, weapons power. And so what we have here is this tit for tat. You know, the U.S. develops a bomb, then the Soviets do it, then the U.S. is not going to be outdone, so they go bigger, badder, and the Soviets match that. And so we're going to reach a point where this mutually assured destruction phrase is going to enter the American lexicon. You know, it's going to be a part of Americans' lives, because the possibility that if any of these countries use this weapon on each other, it could very possibly lead to a, you know, like the Holocaust all over again, you know, like we're the end of the world, the end of life as you know it. I was going to say nuclear Holocaust, but we're not there with the nuclear bombs just yet. The idea behind mutually assured destruction is that Americans' fear of retaliation and fear of being outgunned, fear of being outdone by the Soviets has put us in a situation where us building up our weapons arsenal has essentially guaranteed the end of the world as we know it. And that's really, you know, it needs to be noted. So in 52, the U.S. developed the hydrogen bomb. The Soviets do it a year later. We reached the point of no return. Nuclear proliferation is next. You know, these countries and pretty much every country after that is going to be on the hunt for weapons capability on this level, okay? But more on that later. The next thing to happen is, of course, or sort of to continue on with this arms race, is going to manifest itself in the space race between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So the Soviets test their first intercontinental ballistic missile, right, ICBM, on August 1957. And then the U.S. is going to match that, right? So the Soviets do the ICBM in August 1957. They launch Sputnik 1 into orbit in October 1957. And this is a big deal because the U.S. hasn't done any of that yet. So it's really kind of questioning, you know, makes people question, like, is the U.S. really better than the Soviets, or are we just kind of fooling ourselves into thinking that? So the U.S. is going to launch Explorer 1 in January 1958. And then later on that year, NASA is created, okay? So all of this goes into the idea that we have to beat the Soviets, you know, every step of the way, in every single aspect, no matter what, okay? So, of course, like I said, it's going to make people question whether we are truly better than the Soviets or not, and it's going to push us even further, right? We already have this like Cold War mentality where We have to stop the spread of communism. But not only that, it's also about supremacy, right? It's like whose government is better, whose way of life is better, whose society is better, whose quality of life is better. And so we are not going to be outdone or outmatched by the Soviets in any way, even if it comes down to, launching satellites into orbit. It takes on every sort of facet. And your book even talks about the kitchen debate, right, with Nixon and Nikita Khrushchev, where they're essentially debating, looking at stoves and comparing, American homemakers to Soviet ones, and how American women have it so much better than the Soviets one because of this type of technology. And that's the kind of thing that a democracy and capitalistic empire gets you. And so, like I said, it just makes its way into every single way of life. But there's consequences to that. In the next lecture, we're going to talk about the prosperity of the 1950s, but we're gonna put that off for now. I want to focus on the Second Red Scare and McCarthyism. Okay, so all the Second Red Scare is about. Remember that we've already experienced the first Red Scare after World War I. After World War II, it's just going to be a continuation of that. But McCarthyism is really all about this kind of like fear of communism, fear of communist influence within the government, within American life. And so this period is known as McCarthyism, where a lot of people are going to be looking at each other with suspicion if their ideas are, like I said, they kind of challenge what the U.S. Is all about. They challenge capitalistic businesses and things like that. McCarthyism is essentially a crusade against communist influence within the United States. And it really, McCarthyism goes kind of hand in hand with witch hunts, right? So whenever you hear the term witch hunt being used or McCarthyism being used, it's essentially what it's describing is, a time period when they were going after people with very little proof, very little facts, if any, were provided at all. And charging them of these, accusing them of something that could potentially end their careers, damage their reputations irreparably. And so let's talk a little bit about some of the groups that are involved in this McCarthyism. The first one I want to mention is HUAC, which means House Un-American Activities Committee. We've already seen a clip of Richard Nixon being a part of that, right? I mean, he had a pivotal position to play, role to play in the continuation of that investigation into Alger Hiss. And so in 1938, HUAC is led by this, Republican congressmen that are essentially going to be accusing Democrats of being communists. And, it's all of this back and forth, back and forth. And so one of the phrases that this committee is going to use to go after suspected communists or alleged communists is, are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Yes or no? And so the committee, remember, this is, a House committee. People would come and have to testify in front of it. They're being accused of working for the Soviet Union, or potentially being spies or being communists. And so if you are brought before this committee, if you are accused of participating in this, you had pretty much two options, right? You either answer the questions right? Are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Either yes or no. And it's really kind of, you know, they call this witch hunt for a reason, right? If you guys know anything about the Salem witch trials, you know, people who were accused of being witches back in Salem town, they really only had two options, right? It was either admit that you were a witch, and in which case you were forgiven. But before you were forgiven, you had to sort of repent what you did. And in addition to that, you had to name names, right? So you had to tell us, okay, fine, yes, I did it and I'm sorry. And these are the names of, you know, other witches that live in the town. And so then what happens then is then they go after those witches, right? But here's the thing, right? What if you're not a witch? As in, what if you're not a communist and you're being brought to testify before this House committee? Then you really don't have a lot of options, right? Because then they treat you as a hostile witness, an unfriendly witness, and there's serious consequences for that. So you were either a friendly witness and you testified and you named names, or you did something like, well, I plead the fifth and I'm not gonna, or I'm not, and then they have a right to sort of treat you unfairly. And so what ends up happening here is the government is going to start to crack down, if you will, on doing background checks on government officials, on government employees even. And so it all starts with these loyalty requirements, right? Where they have to take this oath that they are going to uphold the Constitution of the United States. They're going to investigate their background, make sure that there's nothing in there that the Soviets could use to blackmail them. Again, what kind of things could they use to blackmail you? Well, if you had a gambling problem, so if you owed debt to somebody, that is a potential blackmail, what was I going to say? Like a blackmail, like, you know, something they can use to blackmail you. If you owe somebody, if you have a bookie, right? If you owe somebody money, or if money might be a motivating factor for you, then hey, guess what? You're going to be a high-risk employee and you're probably not going to get the job. What if you have, if you're having an affair, if you have a second family, if you have, you know, if you're an alcoholic, or if you have, you know, drug addiction, which, you know, back then it wasn't like, you know, today where there's all kinds of different drugs to go around. But homosexuality is another reason that, you know, somebody could use to blackmail you, because usually if you were, what would happen actually is that it was illegal in some cases to be homosexual, or to live with somebody of the same sex as in a relationship. And so that meant that if you were homosexual, you had to keep it quiet. You were like way in the closet. Some people went to great lengths to hide that, even marrying somebody and having children just to disguise it. So if it was discovered that you were homosexual and the government found out about it, then you wouldn't get the job, you know, you wouldn't pass the vetting process, because that's a potential risk right there for the communists to come in and try to blackmail you into spying for them. Now, why would they blackmail you for this? Well, because it could ruin your reputation. It could mean that you would get fired. It could mean that you could, you know, lose your friends and family, lose your freedom even in some cases. So if there's any kind of vulnerabilities out there, any potential for blackmail, then you wouldn't get the job, right? I mean, this is what we're talking about here, is that the government is so afraid of communist infiltration, so afraid of communism itself, that it's willing to go after its own citizens in order to protect the integrity of the U.S. government. So some of these fears are real, some of them are imagined, but nevertheless, they are ever more becoming increasingly tougher on government employees, okay? a couple of acts here that you need to know. The Hatch Act of 1939 made it illegal to work for the federal government and be a communist. Okay, so they're essentially ruling out anybody that's a communist or has ever been a communist. If that's you, then I'm sorry, you can't work for the federal government. In 1940, the Smith Act, it made it illegal to participate in organizations that promoted overthrowing the government. So again, remember looking back to the parties, not the parties, excuse me, the labor unions and things like that. So if you were involved in a labor union that talked about, you know, anything dealing with anarchism or socialism or communism, then again, the Smith Act made that illegal. You couldn't do it. And then finally, the McCarthyism Act of 1950 required members of the communist organizations inside of the United States to register with the Attorney General's office. So essentially what they want is a list of known communists in the U.S. That they could check on, that they could keep an eye on. And so, you know, we're really kind of reaching this moment where it's getting a lot, it's becoming very difficult for communists to live in the United States, even if they have no interest in overthrowing the government or anything. Like, let's say they're communists or socialists because of their views on capitalism, or, you know, because they feel that the government is unfair or that society is unfair in some way. You know, I mean, we could go on and on about this, but we're not going to discuss the tenets of communism or why somebody would support it. The point here is that the Cold War mentality is about, you know, snuffing out any kind of communist influence, whether that be in the workplace, in a neighborhood, within the government, I mean, in all aspects of life. I mean, we don't want communism to spread outside of the United States, and we certainly don't want to see it inside of the United States either. So again, remember, it doesn't matter who it is. If they're communists, it's bad, right? It's bad for the U.S. So we sort of see just this increased accusations being thrown around. And so that kind of brings us to a case here with the Hollywood 10 in 1947, where you will have these members of Hollywood, writers, you know, people that do screenplays, directors, producers, that are going to be accused of working for the Soviet Union, by producing movies, films, you know, TV programs that promote communist ideals or, you know, challenge the United States in any way. Because what's happening here is a lot of people are afraid that as movies become more popular, as TVs become more popular, that what people are watching is somehow influencing their way of thinking. And so the Hollywood 10 are going to be put on trial, and they're going to face, you know, very rigid questioning. And I'm going to show you guys a clip of what that looked like, okay?
At home, Americans feared red subversion. Congress revived the House Committee on Un-American Activities. In 1947, the committee investigated Hollywood, factory of America's imagination.
Have you ever observed any communistic information in any scripts? Well, I turned down quite a few scripts because I thought they were tinged with communistic ideas. They haven't attempted to use me, I don't think, because apparently they know that I'm not very sympathetic to communism. There has been a small group within the Screen Actors Guild which has consistently opposed the policy of the Guild board and officers or the Guild itself, as evidenced by the vote on various issues. That small clique has been referred to, has been discussed as more or less following the tactics that we associate with the Communist Party.
If I had my way about it, they'd all be sent back to Russia or some other unpleasant place.
Ten witnesses, the Hollywood 10, defied the committee's right to ask about their beliefs.
Are you a member of the Communist Party? Or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
It's unfortunate and tragic that I have to teach this committee the basic principles of Americanism.
That's not the question. The question is, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
I'm framing my answer in the only way in which any American citizen can frame his
Then you
answer to
denied-
the question
then
which
you-
invades his, absolutely invades
Then
his
you
right.
deny, you refuse to answer that question. Is that correct?
I have told you that I will
All right.
offer my beliefs, my affiliations, and
You're the
everything
witness.
else
You're the
to the
witness.
American public, and they will know where I stand, as they do from what I have written.
Stand away
I
from
have
the
written
stand.
for Americanism for many years, and I shall
Stand away from the stand.
fight for the Bill of Rights, which you are trying to
Take
destroy.
this man away from the stand.
Others from the film industry demonstrated their support for the constitutional rights of the 10.
Are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
I believe I have the right to be confronted with any evidence which supports this question. I should like to see what you have.
Oh, well, you would. Yeah. Well, you will pretty soon. The witness is excused.
Either you completely cooperated with the committee, which meant saying yes or no to the question about whether you were a communist or ever had been, and if the answer was yes, as it was in my case, we knew the next question was who else was, and we certainly didn't want to go into that.
The 10 were imprisoned. With hundreds more, they were blacklisted, their livelihoods taken away.
People generally in Hollywood were pretty scared to have anything to do with us. Whereas before we went to prison, they had not been nearly as scared, and there were plenty of undercover arrangements that were made to write scripts under pseudonyms for a good deal less money than you were accustomed to being paid. There were a couple of possible suicides as a result of it. There were a good deal of misery.
Americans feared that the enemy would take advantage of their freedoms, that agents of communism were undermining America.
Okay. You know, like I said, it was very tough to get around the questioning. You could get blacklisted. You could get fired. They were, you know, they treated you as a hostile witness if you weren't willing to declare or to testify, and give them the information that they wanted to know. In that video, I hope you guys noticed Ronald Reagan was there, and, you know, he was treated like a friendly witness, right? I mean, he gave them all the information that they wanted to know. Walt Disney did not come out in that video, but he was also a friendly witness, right? So, you know, all of this is going to capitulate with Senator Joseph McCarthy kind of going out after members of Congress, his political opponents, pretty much anybody, right? And the way that he does this is, by the way, he's a Republican from the state of Wisconsin. What he does here is he basically is going to go around accusing people of being members of the Communist Party. And what he does is, you know, he pretty much like takes a piece of paper and, you know, says things like, you know, I have here in my hand the list of, you know, 10 known communists working, you know, within the State Department or working for the federal government. And, you know, he does these speeches and, you know, he keeps increasing that number, right? It's like 10, no, it's 15, right? Or it's 20. And he never releases uses that information. He never gives any names. He uses this kind of like as a way to distinguish himself politically, as a way to go after his political opponents. You know, he ends up going after the State Department, and, you know, he pretty much takes it way too far when he goes after the Army. So, yeah, what does it say? I have here in my hand a list of 205 that were known to be to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party and who nevertheless are still working and shaping the policy of the State Department. You know, this guy is making up stories, right? It's all a bunch of malarkey. It's not true. But he uses that as a political soapbox, right? In order to go after Democrats who are perceived to be soft on communists, whereas the Republicans were like hard on communists. And I know that sounds really funny, but it's supposed to be this kind of like macho, like ultra-American thing to go after communism, and it made you like virile and masculine, whereas the Democrats were, you know, a bunch of softies that, you know, pinkos and, you know, allies to our enemy. And so anyways, Joseph McCarthy is going to do this, and by saying that somebody is a member of the Communist Party, I mean, it had irreparable damages to their reputation. They would end up getting fired, or they wouldn't get hired at all, or they would lose their positions, they would lose influence. And this guy did this in the most irresponsible fashion, but it seemed like people were just couldn't get enough of it. Right? It's like they would tune in, they would watch this stuff on TV and or listen to it on the radio. And it, like I said, it just permeated every aspect of American life. And, you know, it played out even in American politics. So there's going to be a huge pushback eventually when McCarthy goes after the Army. Okay, let me see if this video works, hopefully, so you can see what I'm talking about here. Oh, ish, I knew that wasn't gonna. Oh, it's like one of my favorite clips. I'm sorry, it's not working. But anyways, I mean, it really kind of, it had this huge effect where, you know, McCarthyism, anytime you hear that phrase, McCarthyism, you know, it's shorthand for recklessness, you know, mean, nastiness, in the politics, accusing somebody without any proof, without any kind of evidence whatsoever, and doing this, like I said, in a very irresponsible manner where, you know, he is accusing people and hurting their livelihoods, affecting their lives in ways that can never be undone. Ultimately, what happens is there's this, like what we saw right now, like a hearing where Joseph, it's being publicized, so people are tuning in, they're watching it, and McCarthy goes after the Army, and you know, he's testifying. He's like just a bunch of, you know, baloney and this and that. And I know of a guy, and, you know, he's accusing this young guy that has no connection to any communist organization whatsoever. And ultimately what happens is on live TV, the defense for this young man comes out and says, you know, Mr. McCarthy, you've sat, you know, across from me this whole time and you've never even bothered to look this way. You know, where is the proof? Have you no sense of dignity, sir? At long last, have you no shame? And it was one of those like very like dramatic moments of TV. Like I said, it was being played live. People are watching this. And it's almost like when this man stood up to McCarthy and said that, this, you know, this guy's reckless rampage finally came to an end. It was almost like everybody was just so supportive, like finally somebody tells them what we've all been thinking. Because that's the thing, it's like they gave him this power. They empowered him. They didn't tell him to stop. He kept going after all of these people in a very reckless manner. It was very irresponsible. He was mean-spirited, and nobody really stopped him because everybody was afraid. And all in all, what this means is that the Cold War, containment, this fear, paranoia, is going to lead, it inspires McCarthyism here. But, at the end of the day, when we look at the toll that McCarthyism had on American society, the fact of the matter remains that a lot of people were afraid to stand up to him. Or to anybody in general, like the worst thing that anybody could call you was a pinko or a commie, that had severe consequences. And when we look at McCarthyism and this so-called crusade where he had no evidence to show, it really tells us something about the fear that Americans felt, but then also the fact of the matter remains that anybody that didn't stand up to McCarthy, anybody that didn't stand up to people who would use communism, to would use containment as a tactic to bully others, were complicit in this sort of crusade, this going after people, because this had huge consequences, right? People are going to be pushed into conforming, pushed into, these roles, gender roles, where they cannot question anything. They have to, just kind of like toe the line. And people were very aware of what it meant to be accused of communism or being a spy. And so there's a lot of guilt and a lot of, not guilt, but there's a lot of responsibility to go around here. The fact that so many went along with McCarthy, the fact that not a whole lot of people stood up to him, is evidence of that collective guilt. That is just another sort of aspect of the Cold War mentality. In the 50s, it was really, really bad. But that's going to continue, right? The Cold War is not going to go away. It's going to continue until 1991 with the fall of the Soviet Union. But in the next lecture, we are going to focus on the civil rights movement and talk about, what's going on as well with Vietnam and JFK and LBJ and all of that. But for now, we're going to end it here. Okay. So I hope that if you guys have any questions that you will email me. I'll be happy to clear up any doubts or any confusion that you might have over the subject matter. As always, don't forget, read your book, follow the prezzies, and, let me know if there's anything that I left out or that you would like to contribute to this. Let's get that discussion going if you want. Okay. I hope you guys have a great day. I'll be seeing you on the next one.